Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and happy Earth Day. My name is Catherine Target Gross, and I am the Sustainability Officer at Lehigh University. On behalf of the Office of Sustainability and in collaboration with Lehigh's Environmental Initiative, the Lehigh Sustainability Council, Environmental Studies Program, and the EcoRep Leadership Program, we want to welcome you to our Earth Day keynote address, where we will hear from Dr. Julian Agyeman, a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts University. He will be speaking with us today about just sustainabilities in policy, planning, and practice. Social equity is one of the three pillars of sustainability, and Lehigh University is committed to becoming an anti-racist institution. We commit to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and definitively state our obligation to raise our voices against injustice and provide support to and advocacy on behalf of those at Lehigh who are subject to it. We are thrilled you have joined us for this year's keynote address. Earth Week is typically a vibrant and lively week on campus where we host an annual Earth Day fair, among many other events and activities. Although the pandemic prevents us from gathering at a fair for a second year, we are happy that you are able to virtually connect with us today to celebrate the 51st anniversary of Earth Day. I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Audrey McSain, who will go over the format of the event and introduce our speaker. Audrey.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. So hi, everyone. My name is Audrey McSain, and I'm the Sustainability Program Manager here at Lehigh University. To touch briefly upon the format of this event, Dr. Agyeman will speak for about 45 minutes, and we will leave the remaining time for Q&A. We encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature at any time, but we will be holding all questions until the end. Now a little bit about our speaker. Dr. Julian Agyeman is a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts University. He is the originator of the increasingly influential concept of just sustainabilities, the intentional integration of social justice and environmental sustainability. He centers his research on critical explorations of the complex and embedded relations between humans and the urban environment, whether mediated by governments or social movement organizations, and their effects on public policy and planning processes and outcomes, particularly in relation to notions of justice and equity. He believes that what our cities can become, sustainable, smart, sharing, and resilient, and who is allowed to belong in them, recognition of difference, diversity, and a right to the city, are fundamentally and inextricably interlinked. We must therefore act on both belonging and becoming together, using just sustainabilities as the anchor, or face deepening spatial and social inequities and inequalities. He is the author of 12 books, including Just Sustainabilities, Development in an Unequal World, Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class, and Sustainability, and Sharing Cities, A Case for Truly Smart and Sustainable Cities, one of Nature's top 20 books of 2015, and in 2018, he was awarded the Athena City accolade by KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden, for his outstanding contribution to the field of social justice and ecological sustainability, environmental policy, and planning. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Julian Agyeman.
Thank you, Lehigh, for inviting me on this great day when President Biden announced that we are back in the world community and we are looking to a 50% reduction in CO2 by 2030. Ambitious, but a great signal to the rest of the world. I want to start my comments by acknowledging the land on which I stand at the moment in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm on the traditional territory of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, their past, present, and future, and commit to a principle of respect and care as part of this Earth Day meeting. If we were to go out onto the streets of any US city, any city in the world, and ask, what is sustainability? I guarantee 9 out of 10, or maybe even 10 out of 10 people who had an opinion would say, well, it's about the environment. And of course, it is about the environment. Environmental sustainability is very important, but I could imagine that we could legislate and regulate for a green and environmentally sustainable world, but it could also be socially unjust. Would it be sustainable? I don't think so. We came up with this idea of just sustainabilities because what we noticed in the way people were speaking, in the academic world, in the practitioner world, in the advocacy world, people were talking about environment. And I said, there's an equity deficit in sustainability. Let's fill it. Let's come up with a concept that really acknowledges the deep umbilical link we have to the planet, but also recognizes the deep link we have to commitments to social justice within our planetary capacities. And so this book really broke new ground in 2002 by looking at equity and justice explicitly. Every chapter, not just the one chapter saying, oh, equity and justice is important, because every single chapter in this book, this is why it's become in many ways the harbinger of this concept of just sustainabilities. And in effect, what we're looking at here is the links, the relationship between environmental quality and human equality. I challenge you, think about environmental degradation the world over, the Niger Delta, the Amazon, mining in Australia. Who is affected by these environmental degradations? Environmental degradation is almost always associated with social injustices and human rights infringements. And so we argued in this book that sustainability can't simply be seen as a green issue or an environmental concern, important though those concerns are, but that we said a truly sustainable society is one where wider questions of social need, social welfare, economic opportunity are integrally linked to the limits imposed by supporting ecosystems. So I am acknowledging limits here, but I'm saying social justice within ecological limits. That's the challenge. I don't usually advertise other people's books, folks. I'm an academic. I want you to buy my books. But this book, The Spirit Level, Why Equality is Better for Everyone, is an outstanding book. 2009, two British researchers, they gathered 40 years of data from around the world, comparative quantitative data from around the world. And here's the headline. It's not poverty, it's inequality that is the most corrosive force in our society today. And inequality is manifest more in societies, obviously, where inequality is greater, there are more social problems. So whether it's teen pregnancies, whether it's high school dropout rates, whether it's incarceration rates, you name it, across any social malaise, the greater the gap between rich and poor, the more these problems occur. They also found that in societies with the greatest levels of inequality, there are higher advertising revenues. You might think that's a strange thing to research. Why would you look at advertising revenues and inequality? Well, they found a correlation between inequality and advertising. The more inequality in society, the more advertising revenues there were in that society. Because inequality heightens competitive consumption. So here's what happens. In more unequal societies, people are desperately consuming, competitively consuming to keep up with the Joneses, to get into the next level of society. And that doesn't happen just the poor into the middle class. That happens in the middle to the upper middle into the rich into the super rich into the Jeff Bezos class. Everybody's on a consuming, competitive escalator, if you like. So inequality drives competitive consumption. What does competitive consumption drive? Our carbon footprint. They make the case that inequality drives climate change. The more unequal our societies, the bigger our carbon footprint. How often do you read or hear in the sort of climate change activist literature that inequality is the big problem? We're all about sustainable agriculture, sustainable transportation. Absolutely. Absolutely necessary. But if we want to get a grip on climate change, yes, we can change our industrial processes, but we also need to look to the gap between rich and poor. Inequality is a driver of climate change. So if we really want to understand sustainability, our focus should be on both human equality and environmental quality together. And how am I defining just sustainabilities? It's about the need to ensure a better quality of life for all now and into the future in a just and equitable manner while living within the limits imposed by supporting ecosystems. And implicit in this are 4 conditions. Sustainability, a just sustainability, must improve people's quality of life and well-being. It must meet the needs of both present and future generations. Many formulations of sustainability just talk about future generations. It's got to improve the life of people now. We need justice and equity in terms of recognition, process, procedure, and outcome. Now, let me just unpack this a bit. You all know about environmental injustice, and you know about procedural justice, the right to be heard, the right to have your voice in law and in policy about the environment or other issues. We know about distributional justice, who gets the goods and the bads. But what about that term recognition? Very, very, very important. Even more important as of Tuesday, recognition is about being recognized in society, and there is no greater cry at the moment for recognition than Black Lives Matter. Say her name, say his name. Indigenous cries for recognition. Women's, LGBTQ, recognition is a precursor to justice. If we don't recognize the rights of people to be, how can we ever think about reconciliation? Or further down the line, any form of reparation or restorative justice. So recognition, I think, is the most important cry for justice at the moment, to recognize groups in society and to recognize their place in society. Then these 3 conditions must obviously be carried out within ecosystem limits. We're on one planet. There is no planet B. There's no waste pipe going somewhere else and resource pipe coming in. This is all we got. We've got to do things better with what we've got. Just a little plug for myself here. Just Sustainabilities predates and underlies both the Sustainable Development Goals, and I am very pleased to see that the Sustainable Development Goals fully recognize equity, justice, voice, gender, race. All of these issues are recognized. Some of you might know about Kate Raworth and Oxfam and the donuts. We have to live within the ecological ceiling, but we mustn't let people fall below the social foundation. So the safe and just space for humanity is the donut. I don't know why she chose the word donut. It's the most unhealthy food you could think of. It could have been a whole wheat bagel or something like that, but I suppose that doesn't have, you couldn't say whole wheat bagel economics, but donut economics works. What is donut economics? It's just sustainabilities. That safe and just space for humanity is just sustainabilities. Now, working as I do as a professor of urban planning, I want to give you 3 ideas that are going to inform the 3 case studies or 3 examples I'm going to give you in a few minutes. So the first is, what is urban planning? Urban planning is managing our coexistence in shared space. 2 very powerful words, coexistence and sharing space. And whether we're looking at environmental issues, transport, housing, or other urban conflicts, what we're looking at is sharing our coexistence in space, in shared space, with people who are increasingly different from us. Our cities are becoming increasingly diverse and different. How do we manage our coexistence? How do we celebrate coexistence in shared space across these differences? The second point is this relationship that was mentioned between belonging and becoming. Look, as sustainability advocates, as you are, as an urban planner, we're always dreaming of better, what we can become, what our wetland can become, what our city can become. And that's great. We must never stop dreaming. But my contention is we spend too much time dreaming about the future, and we've forgotten about the fact that we are denying belonging in our cities to too many people, whether it's immigrants, whether it's non-recognition, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ, whether it's moving on homeless people, whether it's displacing people through gentrification. Increasingly, we are denying belonging to large groups in society. So my worry is that when we think about becoming and what our cities can become, we're thinking about really elite spaces unless we think about, bringing in these people and stopping this disbelonging, this pushing out of people, because our cities can only become as good as who gets to belong in our cities. And if we want elite cities, well, carry on doing what we're doing, displacing, ignoring, misrecognizing, disrecognizing people. Finally, just sustainabilities and urban planning is about human scaled settlements. We need the human scale. But I want you to put a letter E on the word human. I want humane scaled planning, planning for human dignity, planning with empathy, planning for a right to your environment, a right to enjoy your environment. So humane scale planning. So coexistence in shared space, attention to belonging as well as becoming, and humane scaled as well as human scale planning, I think are really important. So I want to spend the rest of my talk giving you 3 examples. One is this concept that I use a lot called spatial justice. How do we allocate rights in urban spaces and places? Very topically, I want to talk about the Minneapolis Paradox. How is it that one of the most green, liberal cities in the US ends up as the epicenter of our current introspection of structural racism? And then I want to finish up by looking at food justice with challenging you to think differently about the word local. What is local food? Who gets to say what local food is when we live in intercultural societies and people have different ideas about what local food is? So let me start with spatial justice. So you all know what social justice is. It says we shouldn't distribute life chances according to class, race, etc. Well, spatial justice says we shouldn't distribute opportunity according to geography. I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just across the river in Boston, are 2 of the poorest neighborhoods in Boston, Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan. Why is it? Why is that? That's spatially unjust, that in one place, your life chances, life expectancy, etc. is very good, and in another place, it's not so good. And here, the example is a city with a wall. This is Jerusalem. You could think of Nicosia in Cyprus, separating the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots. Think of Belfast in Northern Ireland in the days of the past, when the walls used to separate Catholics and Protestants. But you know what? We're really good in the US. We don't need walls. We've got freeways, we've got rail tracks, we've got creeks, and on one side they live, and on the other side you live. And your life chances, life expectancy, quality of life is much higher than theirs on the other side. And if I were here in the audience, there's 116 people, and I were to ask you to put your hands up if you lived in a community or you grew up in a community where those rules applied, I think about 40% of you would agree. We lay lines, and they're not walls, but they are effectively walls. And I want to argue that urban planning is largely responsible for this segregated society that we live in. But let me ground this concept of spatial justice by looking at 2 streets. On the right is Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge, near where I live. And on the left is Södervägen in Gothenburg, Sweden. 2 streets, identical width, but as you can see visually, they couldn't be more spatially differentiated. The Swedes have imposed spatial justice on the street. They've democratized the street. They've prioritized active transportation, whether it's cycling and walking. They've prioritized the streetcars, and you can see there's 1 streetcar just a little bit further down from the one that's closest to us. And then if you come back, there's another, they're frequent and they're free. And to the left of the streetcar is the only part of the street where private vehicles can go. And you notice there's no vehicles on there. So the Swedes have regulated for spatial justice and street democratization. What have we done in the US? We've gone by the good old American principle of, number 1, you have to have an automobile, and then number 2, the size of your vehicle. The rights to the street in the US are largely governed by having a vehicle and the size of that vehicle. And so a question for you. You're a kid growing up in the apartment blocks along these 2 streets. How are you wired differently if you're the Swedish kid going to school every day or the kid from the US? What effect has it got on you psychologically and well-being wise to come out and see organized chaos on the American street versus spatial justice, democratized streetscape? Now, we've got some data on this. This was done in the 70s. Dan Appleyard's work in San Francisco, we know that basically street traffic, the amount of traffic, the velocity of the traffic is related to social interaction. So on heavily trafficked streets, we have much less friendships, much less acquaintances than we do on lightly trafficked streets. So I think you're thinking, well, what's the Just Sustainabilities take here? Who lives on the heavily trafficked streets and who lives on the lightly trafficked streets? I think I rest my case. The lightly trafficked streets, as I'm going to argue, are often what we call complete streets, with bike lanes, with bump outs, all the things to slow the traffic down. They're nice streets, they've got trees. The heavily trafficked streets are wider, they've got bigger vehicles, often trucks. Those are in the lower income neighborhoods. Spatial injustice in terms of the opportunity for social interaction across streets. Now, we got some good news. Mayor Bloomberg appointed Janet Sadiq Khan as Transportation Commissioner. She brought in Jan Gehl, the organizer of the Copenhagen Miracle, and they enlisted the support and advocacy of New York's transportation advocacy groups. And this is what New York is like today. So top left was when Bloomberg started, and they were just starting the changes in Times Square. And bottom right is what Broadway looks like just outside of Macy's today. We can do this, America. We can change the way we look at streets. Not every street can look like this, but we can prioritize arterial routeways and then have people streets in other places. Now, this picture also tells me something that I really want you to think about. This doesn't just happen. This doesn't happen by chance. If we keep thinking about sustainability or urban planning as what is probable, we're just going to keep in the same old tired paradigm. Bloomberg, Sadiq Khan, the New York advocacy groups, Jan Gehl said, let's do what is possible. Key, urban planning must be about what is possible. Sustainability must be about what is possible. But I told you this word belonging, we're really good at telling people you don't belong. We're very good at hostile architecture, defensive architecture. Top left, that stops kids skateboarding by those studs. The middle top, stopping homeless people sleeping on benches. Most egregiously, putting studs on buildings to stop homeless people sleeping on them. Like we put prongs to stop pigeons landing on ledges. That's how we treat human beings. That's why I want humane scale planning, planning with dignity. That doesn't afford human dignity. Neither does the bottom right picture, which is all too common. I mean, it doesn't say poor door and rich door, but believe me, there are apartment blocks in many major cities around the world, London, Vancouver, I'm sure Philadelphia as well, where by law, the developer has had to put a certain amount of affordable units in. But what they've also done, some of them, is said, well, we don't want them mixing with the wealthy. So the rich go in through the boulevard entrance, high-speed elevator up to the penthouses, and they don't have to mix with those affordable housing people who go in through the back alley. This is not the way we should be treating people ever, but it's certainly in this part of the 21st century. Very, very cynically, bottom left in Seattle, under that bridge, there was a homeless people's encampment, and the city thought, what can we do to get rid of the homeless people? Bing, bright idea. Let's use sustainability infrastructure. Let's use bikes, bike racks to stop homeless people. The city thought, if we use sustainability, nobody can complain. But luckily, the good people of the Seattle biking community said, hey, no, we got a problem with homelessness, but it needs policy and resources, not sticking bike racks there. We don't want that. We don't want to be associated with the inhumane treatment of homeless people. Now, one idea for around spatial justice is my friend Elijah Anderson, a sociologist from Yale, talks about this idea of the Cosmopolitan Canopy. Basically, what he says is most of the time we're walking around the streets of the city and we studiously ignore eye contact with each other. We don't want to look at each other. But he said there are parts of the city, and he calls them cosmopolitan canopies, and the picture in there is of Reading Terminal Market. He said there are parts of the cities where people sit down together across race, ethnic, class, cultural, sexuality differences, and they talk. Often these are food spaces. Food is a very good leveler for this. And they watch a ball game, and then they go back to their lives. But these cosmopolitan canopies are spaces of engagement where people come together and coexist across difference. And implicit in this, or explicit in this, is the concept of contact theory. Contact theory says the more opportunities we have to experience people who are different to us, the more likely we are to be tolerant, treat them with dignity, with civility, and society moves on in a good way. So a question I ask my urban planning students is, can we create cosmopolitan canopies? Shouldn't a goal of urban planning be to create cosmopolitan canopies, spaces of mixing? Because we are self-sorting, we are segregating in many ways. How do we stop that? How do we get people to respect and enjoy the dignity of the other? And the other is increasingly a part of our lives. So kids spaces like this are very good spaces for contact theory. The kids are playing, the parents, guardians are on the edge, and they start talking to each other. And it doesn't matter who the person is, they talk to each other. Now, people have said, oh, but Julian, this isn't going to stop racism. No, it's not. But it's part of the eating away of the stranger danger, the fear of the other. It gives us an opportunity to see that people just want to live their lives. They want to provide for their families. They want to reach their own capabilities. There are more similarities between us than there are differences, is what I'm saying. Now, one urban planning solution is this idea of complete streets, decentering the automobile that's dominated planning of our cities for a century or more, and recentering active transportation, the bike, walking. And here you've got several examples of complete streets design manuals. So it's a very urban design, physical design based concept. But, I want to invoke the ideas of the late great geographer Doreen Massey, who sees places, and I see streets as places, as having no intrinsic meaning, rather they are constantly shifting articulations of social relations through time. She's saying that places are social spaces, they are social ecologies of place, whereas most urban designers are physical designers. And you see on the right the design of a complete street. Now, I'm not saying that we can get away from that, but the street on the left, you can't design that. That's happened because of human enterprise and because of just the humans enjoying their presence in a market. So I worry that this obsession with complete streets is disconnecting our streets from the social, structural, symbolic, discursive, and historical realities of local communities. Another aspect of this, Los Angeles has a complete streets policy. Would you believe that? The motor metropolis has a complete streets policy. And actually, LA City Council is doing a lot of good work. But here's the problem. Until very recently, street vending was not allowed. Let's just take stock of this. LA is one of the biggest metropolises of Southeast Asian and Latinx cultures. Who's been to South America, Southeast Asia? The streets are alive with street vendors. So LA says we have a complete streets policy, but you can't do what your culture demands on our streets. That was until very recently. So it was illegal until recently when the city permitted it. And it was only permitted because of the Trump administration's threat to deport undocumented workers. And the city was worried that because ICE knew that this was illegal street vending, that they would prey on street vendors in the hope that some of them were undocumented and could be deported. So let's think about complete streets. There's nothing wrong with the idea, but the question I'm asking is, who gets to define what a complete street is? Now, I'm the editor of a book series, and really we're focusing in this book series on green gentrification, because one of the problems with complete streets, as I showed you in the slide about the social interaction on streets, once you green a street, once you make a street more sustainable, walkable, rents rise, house prices rise. Walkability is used as a metric of urban sustainability, as I'm going to say in a minute. So one of the big problems is that complete streets contribute to what we call green lining. There are whole neighborhoods now of these complete streets, beautiful neighborhoods. And you know what? The book on the right says greening richens and whitens neighborhoods. That's the way it is. This isn't redlining, which was explicitly racist. Greenlining is done in the name of sustainability, but the effects are very similar. Greening, richening, whitening neighborhoods. One of the worries then in my book, Incomplete Streets, is that without careful thought, these complete streets, narratives and ideas are systematically reproducing many of the urban, spatial and social inequalities and injustices that have characterized US cities for the last century or more. And if I need to drive this home, the key urban sustainability metric, I would say, is walkability. And there's an app to measure walkability, and that's called WalkScore. And you might think, great idea, let's measure the walkability of our neighborhood. Look at the arrow at the bottom of the screen. WalkScore is now part of Redfin. A realty company owns the app for the key urban sustainability metric. Folks, we have compromised and commodified sustainability such that it's now realty territory. Sustainability sells, walkability sells. If you live in a neighborhood which is 90 plus, 90 out of 100 walkable, there's a price premium on that. Absolutely, there's a price premium. Do a bit of research, go look at some realtor stuff, and you'll find that more walkable neighborhoods are much more expensive neighborhoods. Don't get me wrong, WalkScore is a great thing. Walkability is a great thing. Greening neighborhoods is a great thing, but it shouldn't be based on your ability to pay. But that's the way we do it in the United States. Let's think about other public spaces, not the street now, but let's think about urban parks. The reason I focus on the street earlier is because streets are our most commonly used public space. We use streets every day. Parks, we don't use as often, but parks are open to the same kind of thoughts. How could urban parks be rethought for our intercultural society? Most urban parks, like the one on the picture there, were probably designed 100, 150 years ago. Society looked very different then. How do we produce parks for our multi and intercultural societies today? But I want to just look at this book title, Rethinking Urban Parks, Public Space and Cultural Diversity, not biodiversity, cultural diversity. In this new century, the book says, we're facing a different kind of threat to public space, not one of disuse, but of patterns of design and management that exclude some people and reduce social and cultural diversity. The way we design and manage our parks is reducing social and cultural diversity. I'd go further. I would say it's not just design and management, it's the programming of parks as well. But here's the thought. Public policy. What about the Parks Commissioner who says, you know what, we're going to rethink our parks. Let's have the local community co-design, co-manage, and co-program the parks. Don't you think the parks would be better used? They would be better socially policed by the community. They would be perhaps places, spaces of engagement where people would meet across difference. Opportunities like that can't be missed, but it takes political courage and vision. And it takes a parks manager, who, isn't an old white man, is somebody who's got some vision and somebody who's got some intercultural sensibilities. Now, there's a great report, it's now a little bit dated, but it's called Immigrant Engagement in Public Open Space, Strategies for the New Boston. And it really looks at how immigrants are now part of the majority in Boston. And I have to say, there's an election, a mayoral election coming up in Boston. There are 6 candidates. They are all of color, 2 men, 4 women. Now, Boston has an interim mayor of color, but it's going to have an elected mayor of color. This is huge for Boston, one of the last major cities in the US, without having had a mayor of colour. But there are pockets, Friends of the Park organisations, which are still resolutely white. So you've got a city that is moving with an intercultural speed, and you've got these little pockets that govern public spaces that are largely white, very well connected with funders and individual donors. How's that going to play out in the future? Now, some immigrants are not being engaged, but they are engaging themselves and getting to belong by going to landscapes, cityscapes that are familiar. A Guatemalan American in Boston says, I think one of the reasons that that place is so popular with us Latinos is because of the willows. Willows in Guatemala are very common. They grow beside rivers. People like Herta Park on the banks of the Charles because it looks like home. Familiarity. A lot of immigrants are looking for familiar spaces. Remember that as I go to talk about food, because I'm going to bring that back in. In Copenhagen, I mean, you might think Danish cities are full of tall blonde Danes. Well, newsflash, Copenhagen is an extremely diverse city, and especially in the neighborhood of Nørrebro. And you can see here this park, Superkilen Park. I do, Google it, take a look at it. It's a very, very interesting idea. 3 sections to the park. You can see the red zone, the black zone, and the green zone. And if you look in there, you can see there's all kinds of artifacts. What the designers did was they consulted the community. We're developing this park. What do you want to see? People said, we want to see artifacts from our homes. Familiarity again. So the Guatemalan and the willows, the familiarity in the park in Copenhagen, work that is being done in Sheffield, England, in the Department of Landscape by the Transnational Urban Outdoors Research Group, is looking at deep ethnography. How do we get to understanding neighborhoods? We don't just need demographic data, which says 10% Latino, 20% Asian, 40% Black. What we need is deep ethnographic data. And there's a great paper that they wrote called Ethnographic Understanding of Ethnically Diverse Neighborhoods to Inform Urban Design Practice. They looked at neighborhoods and the ethnic makeup of the neighborhoods and did deep ethnographic work and derived some principles of urban design from that. This is about belonging, helping people to feel that they belong. They produced a great resource pack called Refugees Welcome in Parks. Asylum seekers, refugees, who needs the healing space of nature and parks more than refugees and asylum seekers who've often been through traumatic times? These are the levels we think about when we think about just sustainabilities and who uses our public spaces, our parks. The second issue I wanted to talk about is what I call the Minneapolis Paradox. And this is a piece that I wrote. You can Google it. If you just Google this, you'll get to it. Urban planning as a tool of white supremacy, the other lesson from Minneapolis. Now, what's really interesting is Minneapolis is like Portland. It's a green city. It's a fabulous green city. The best park system in the US, 10 years running, according to the Trust for Public Land, one of the best cities in the US for exercise. It's got the 3rd most bike commuters. It's affordable, it's got opportunity, and it's got wealth. That's if you're white. If you're not white, it's not so good. Racial inequality in Minneapolis is among the worst in the nation. The black-white income gap, what people get for their jobs, is very high, nearly the highest in the nation. The black-white home ownership gap, the so-called wealth gap, the wealth that passes on through generations, is the highest in the nation. And the opportunity or achievement gap in schools is very high for white and Native American and white and Black students. Why is this? So I contacted Kirsten Delegard, who runs a project in Minneapolis called Mapping Prejudice. And again, I urge you to go and take a look at it. And she said, all that civic rhetoric about Minneapolis being a model metropolis at the cutting edge of great urban planning obscures darker truths about the city. And so, of course, I want to know what the darker truths are. Why is this super green, super liberal city harboring these darker truths? First, it was really about 1900, by 1900, the city had a very well established and pretty evenly distributed people of color population, especially African Americans. And then something happened in the early 1900s and persisted till the 60s, and that was these racialized covenants. This home shall not be rented or sold to anybody other than members of the Caucasian race. No Negroid, Mongoloid, Turkish, Oriental, horrifically racist language. You can go online and see it all. But these covenants started to concentrate people of color, African Americans, in North Minneapolis. And it did that for 60 years until they were made illegal. But we know that when things are made illegal, it doesn't mean that they stop. They just go underground. And then there was racist zoning until 1917, when it was struck down by the Supreme Court. And then people thought, well, what are we going to do now? I know, let's have single family zoning. Let's zone for single, we can't do racist zoning, but if we do single family zoning, we will have the same effect because socioeconomically, they won't be able to afford these neighborhoods. And so 70% of residential land in Minneapolis is single family zoned. If that wasn't enough, we then had redlining when in the post Second World War years, when government and so federal loans, private loans were denied to people in these red line districts, which were deemed hazardous. And for hazardous, read African American, people of color neighborhoods. So any one of these three things, racialized covenants, single family zoning, redlining, is effective. But if you think about the synergistic effect of these three, you have racial segregation then and now. And I tell you, only one country in the world has done it better than the United States, and that's apartheid South Africa, with the Group Areas Act, and you actually had to have a pass to go between different neighborhoods, different zones, if you like. Heather Worthington, who's now the former director of long range planning, said there's a direct link between those practices in the late 19th and early 20th century and today's modern zoning plans. And part of the impetus for changing how we view land use is to try to undo those impacts. I put it another way. Urban planning is the spatial toolkit for articulating, implementing, and maintaining white supremacy, and we can do something about it. So what is Minneapolis doing? Well, again, like I said, it's a young, progressive, democratic city council, and it was the first large city to vote to end single family zoning. So now you can have duplexes, triplexes on single family zoned land. The city enacted the Minneapolis 2040 plan. Goal number one, as you see there, is eliminate disparities. Minneapolis will see all communities fully thrive regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, country of origin, religion, zip code, having eliminated deep-rooted disparities in wealth, opportunity, housing, safety, and health. Ambitious goals, and there are about 30 or 40 different policies, if you go to the plan, that are in support of this primary goal. So the city is doing something, but I just want to point out one thing. The city is policed by a police force of which 93% don't live in Minneapolis. If you don't look like or understand the community in which you live, can you effectively understand it, police it, be involved with it? How does that work? So I just lay that out there because I think it's very important that our public servants, our public safety officials should understand the community, that idea of deep ethnography. Okay, my final few comments are on the idea of food justice, and here's a little book opportunity. The book was mentioned, Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class and Sustainability, but I want to jump to this question: what are local foods in intercultural societies? So here's George and Julia Bowling at the Bowling Farm in Maryland. They're tobacco farmers, and the state of Maryland is trying to get farmers out of tobacco and to diversify into other crops. So being good American entrepreneurs, they're thinking, what are we going to do? What shall we grow? And it comes across their bows, if you like, that there's about 120,000 Africans living in the DC area, many of whom are middle and upper middle class, diplomats, lawyers, professors, doctors, you name it. And guess what? They want to eat locally grown African food. And so the Bowlings, again, being good entrepreneurs, worked with the African community and the University of Maryland Extension Service to look at what will grow, what African stuff will grow in the Maryland soils and climate. And there's actually a resource pack that you can get online, which tells you about the culture, the food, some recipes, etc. And so the sign outside the Bowling farm is now African produce. That's their farm. What are local foods in an intercultural society? Are they what the increasingly influential and ecologically minded alternative food movement, is it what they say should grow? Or is it what our increasingly different and diverse populations want us to grow in our climates? So what are local foods? Now, I'm a geographer. There is no such thing as local. There is no geographic definition of local. It's whatever we can persuade each other it is. So clearly what the Africans are doing is thinking of a cultural local rather than a local, in the sense that they're thinking of bringing foods in. And if we jump to San Diego, Filipino immigrants in San Diego were asked by a young PhD researcher, what do you think local foods are? And the Filipinos said, well, it's what we grow in our yards. It's what we eat in our restaurants. What the Filipinos, what the Africans are talking about, or what they are practicing is translocalism. It appears that immigrants bring their local with them. The Guatemalan and the Willows, he goes to a place that's familiar to him. The Africans and the Filipinos want to grow food that will grow here because it makes them feel good, and it's translocalism. In Canada, Metro Vancouver, 20% of farmers in the Greater Vancouver region are Chinese Canadians. And they don't use the main locus of food selling, which is the farmers market. They use their own network of farmers markets. The Chinese have created their own network, largely because of anti-Chinese racism and just Chinese entrepreneurialism. And I gave this talk in Vancouver about 10 years ago. An East African woman came up to me afterwards and she said, you know what, Julian, it's really interesting. I go to the Chinese farmers markets because they grow the food that I want to eat. Should we say, oh, you should use the farmers markets, we want bigger farmers markets, etc. Or should we allow for this cultural expression? Food justice would say, let people express themselves and their food cultures and their food ways in ways that mean something to them. Another level of this is the now defunct South Central Farms in LA, the largest urban farm in the United States till it was bulldozed in 2006, and 96% Latinx communities using the farm. You can see here, these women are not just cropping intercultural crops, they're doing it in a way that is redolent of where they lived in Oaxaca. I planted this garden because it's a little space like home. We grow the same plants that I had back in my garden in Oaxaca. We can eat like we ate at home, and it makes us feel like a part of who we are. It allows us to keep a part of who we are after coming to the United States. They are placemaking, they are nesting through food. So the Guatemalan, the African, the Filipinos, the Oaxacans, all are expressing themselves in choices about place, space, and food. There's also, some of you might not know, but there's a network of 50 refugee farms around the United States. Places like New York, Burlington, Lowell, Massachusetts, Minneapolis, Phoenix, San Diego. This is New Roots Farm in San Diego. This is where immigrants, refugees, and established farmers come together in a sort of intercultural setting to give refugees and new immigrants a foothold, if you like, in American agriculture. This is the new agriculture. You don't hear about this much in food justice, but this is intimately about food justice, allowing people the expression of growing culturally relevant foods in neighborhoods that perhaps they weren't grown in before. Final thought, this is my latest book, The Immigrant Food Nexus, Borders, Labor and Identity in North America. If you're interested in this kind of immigration food stuff, this is the book for you. Quick summary. We need to think about managing our coexistence in shared space. We need to foster belonging as well as becoming. We need to foster engagement and belonging using deep ethnographies, not simply demographic data, which tells us nothing about the culture, the daily social practices, etc. We need to engage in intercultural, culturally competent planning, policy making. We need to practice humane scaled and human scaled urban planning, planning for human dignity, planning for empathy. And above all, I want to leave you with the thought, social justice never simply happens. There's never been a policy that was designed around economic efficiency, environmental protection, that led to greater social justice. We have to bake social justice and equity in at the get-go in policy making, and then we will get to social justice. It never simply happens. Thank you.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you, Julian. So everyone, if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature. We will get through as many of your questions as we can with the time that we have left. So first question that we have is, how can we make sure that projects designed to enhance spatial justice benefit the groups typically discriminated against in urban planning and don't just deepen existing social justice injustices?
2 words. Involve them, involve those people in the project. Let them co-produce it with you. Too often we go into neighborhoods and go in with a prescribed set of ideas about what we want to do. Why don't we work with groups? At my department, we've developed what we call a community strategy. And for the last 13 years now, instead of just inviting community groups in to give talks in classes, in my urban planning department, we've formed these community partnerships. We've got something called CORE, co-research, where we don't define what the research is going to be with communities. We find out what their needs are in terms of research, and our students work with them. It's so simple. There's no rocket science to this. We can get rid of spatial injustices. I mean, obviously there are some big structural issues that have to be dealt with in terms of urban planning, but at the micro level, it's all about involving communities. But we use that word community outreach, community involvement. We need to co-produce places and spaces with communities.
Thank you. And has COVID changed how you think about structuring cosmopolitan canopies and other common urban spaces?
Great question. Yes, it has, but in very positive ways. One thing, I mean, obviously, what a horrific thing to happen to humanity. Looking at it in the positive, it has given us the great reset opportunity. We need to reset and rethink our place in nature and amongst each others. COVID has shown us that inequality is deep, and we knew what was going to happen with COVID. We knew who was going to die in greater numbers than the average. But what COVID's done for urban planners is it's made us realize how much people value public space and getting out in the outdoors. It's made us realize, and it's made city planners and politicians prioritize keeping cycle lanes that were laid out when there were less cars on the road. It's made us think about, how do we reduce the number of cars rather than just managing the number of cars that are there? So I think from an urban planning point of view, it's given us a renewed impetus, renewed hope, and a renewed I can't remember what the word is, but it's given us a renewed vigor about looking at public space post-COVID and thinking about how can we enhance spaces so that they can become cosmopolitan canopies. How do we do that? How do we involve communities in doing that? So yeah, out of this horrific situation, I think some good is going to come because the public is appreciating the spaces that they have in their cities.
All right, one of our next questions is, Thomas Frank's book, Commodify Your Dissent, argues that all dissent will be turned into a commodity in a hyper-capitalist society. This predicts sustainability as a form of dissent in America will be commoditized. Can sustainability ever be just in a system dominated by consumer capitalism?
Well, that's a really excellent question. And yes, it can. Because what he's talking about in terms of sustainability is the commodification of environmental sustainability, and I argued it myself. As I said, the fact that complete streets neighborhoods, green neighborhoods, the concept of walkability, every concept of environmental sustainability has been commodified. But we are only at the beginning of framing just sustainabilities, and just sustainabilities centers social justice and equity. Environmental sustainability sees social justice and equity as a desirable second order achievement, but the main thing is environmental protection. So I absolutely agree with the book's premise, but he's talking about a sustainability that is not a radical sustainability that I'm talking about.
All right. Another question is, what professional advice would you give to a university student looking to promote sustainability? What are some career opportunities in urban sustainability that most young people haven't heard about yet?
Well, I'm like a used car salesperson, in promoting the Department of Urban Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts. If you like the stuff that I'm thinking about, our department is for you. We are the #1 master's planning program in the US, and our focus and our esteem is based around the intersection of social justice and sustainability. So if you're interested in making cities more just and sustainable, and remembering, cities are increasingly the home of the majority of people on the planet, and that will increase into the future, then, I can see careers in city planning, urban design as being more and more important. Careers in public health. It takes a village to raise a city. It takes a village to raise a baby, but, it takes everybody in the city to raise that city. I mentioned my interest in this word co-production. How do we co-create the city, co-produce the city? Because at the moment we have experts leading. I don't want to see the end of expertise, but I want to see a level of humility such that people realize that the neighborhoods in which people live, they are the experts. Just as we should, as scientists, respect traditional ecological knowledges. So it's about respecting and recognizing different abilities and different skill sets. And so if you really want to get to grips, I think, with sustainability and certainly sustainable cities, then there's about 80 urban planning programs, accredited programs throughout the nation. But I would say that ours is the only one that really gets to grips in all of its core curriculum and electives with issues of social justice and sustainability.
All right, and we are just about at time, but I want to throw one more question in there. There's an interesting conflict between the trend to grow more native plants, which are more in tune with the local ecology, versus planting vegetation that is not local, but is local to the immigrant community. How do you think we square this conflict?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Think about a large number of our food crops. They're not natives. Potatoes aren't native. A lot of our food crops aren't native. Horticulturalists differ greatly from ecologists. Horticulturalists say what can grow. Ecologists say this is what should grow. Now, you don't know this, but my background is in botany and geography. My PhD thesis was looking at what I call the multicultural city ecosystem of London. I was looking at plants coming to London over thousands of years of inhabitation. You've got some incredible stories, like the plant, I can't remember what its common name is, but its Latin name is Gallinsoga parviflora, and it came on the bedding of sick troops from the Crimean War in the 18th century. Who knew? There's numerous plants that coexist safely in Britain, thousands of them from around the world that are there as the result of immigration and trade over thousands of years from the Bronze Ages onwards. Most plants are good neighbors. We do have some invasives, but you know what? I'm standing here in Massachusetts. In 300 years, we're going to have a climate like Virginia. When do we stop spending on eradicating non-natives, eradicating invasives, when we have a dynamic flux ecology at the moment? It might be a radical view for some of your audience, but how do we say what belongs and what doesn't belong when we live in a world of, you know, thousands of years of travel and mixing? What do we say? Now, I know that there are some real problems. Zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. There are some species, but there's relatively few that cause absolute problems. The Great Tree of London, the London Plane as it's called, is actually a Spanish tree. It's the only one that would grow there in the pollution back in the bad old days. And if you look at a lot of our street trees, they're from around the world. So I'm a big tent ecologist in many ways, but there is a very, very, very interesting debate amongst ecologists, some of whom are the kind of very much nativist, this is what grows, this is what should grow, versus those who think that fluidity and hybridity and other issues in ecosystems are really important. Can I just say, I'm happy if anybody wants to email me. I always say this, and I always get several emails, but if anybody felt that they didn't get the question answered or they want to go further on the question that they answered, I'm happy to take up email conversations.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Agyeman. It was a pleasure having you here today. Unfortunately, we are out of time at this point, but thank you so much for joining us, and everyone that attended today, thank you for joining us on this 51st anniversary of Earth Day. Have a wonderful evening.
Right. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye.